Remakes have certainly been dominating the media scene in the past few years. Companies have realized it's much easier to make money from an existing property that already has a reputation versus a brand new IP that needs a good debut to receive a positive reputation. Nostalgia is a powerful tool that can drive sales through the roof, so why put the time, money, and effort into creating an entirely new game from the ground up when they've already got hundreds of fully completed games that can be given a renovation and a re-release? Even though this video is about remakes, something you can't remake is losing your wallet. This video is sponsored by Exter, creators of the world's largest smart wallet. Being that I'm a female, you may think I'd be carrying around one of those large borderline hand purses for a wallet. Nah, I'm rocking this old thing. But as you can see, it's not exactly the nicest thing out there. Exter creates leather wallets that are both stylish and functional. Accessing your cards is quick, and the RFID protection keeps your cards safe from being digitally scanned by shady passerbys. And if it gets old school stolen from you, Exter's wallets are trackable worldwide, and if you're really lonely on a Friday night, you can even call your wallet to locate it. By using my affiliate link down below in the description and on my pinned comment, you can get an automatic 25% discount at checkout. The gaming market is absolutely flooded with remasters, remakes, and re-releases, and one of the biggest problems is the confusion between the three. Both players and developers tend to use the words remake and remaster interchangeably, despite the fact that they indicate two very different types of visions and goals the developers have for the game. The short of it is that a remaster is a game that has been taken and given a spit shine. The original game is given upscaled graphics with potentially some bug fixes and maybe an updated UI. The main defining feature of a remaster, though, is that it is the original game, original engine, and original code. Remasters can easily walk the line of being a port as well, especially if the only change is an upscaled resolution. For two quick examples, the numerous ports of Sonic Adventure 2 all remain relatively the same from the Battle port to the GameCube, just with a better resolution and somehow more bugs? On the other hand, the Borderlands Game of the Year Enhanced Edition not only cleans up the textures to more modern day standards, but it completely overhauls the UI to be more user-friendly and similar to Borderlands 2's UI. This one can be considered a remaster as opposed to a port because it changes more than just the base resolution. However, despite the relatively simple parameters of a remaster, a remake isn't as nice and clean, because what can define a remake is much broader and more susceptible to individual opinion. It also doesn't help that people, including developers, tend to use the terms remake and remaster interchangeably when describing the game they're working on, which leads to even more confusion. Additionally, with the massive amount of retro remakes that have been happening in the past few years, people have started labeling full remakes as simply remasters due to what they did and didn't bring to the table. I find this to be incorrect due to the distinct differences between remakes and remasters. The confusion, I believe, comes from the fact that different people have different ideas on what they consider to be a remake. What I want to talk about in this video is the two different types of remakes and why it's important to identify which one a remade game is. To categorize into two separate definitions may be simplifying it a bit, but it splits up almost every game cleanly into two categories. These two different variations I like to call the Faithful and the Reinvention. Not the most creative names, but they get the point across as to what type of remake the game is. Let's start with the bare bones definition of a remake before getting into the two different types. A video game remake is a recreation of a previously made game. Remakes do not retain the original game's source code and are made entirely from scratch, or maybe the remains of another game on the same engine. This is the main difference between a remake and a remaster, as remasters retain the original code, but remakes are entirely new games from a development standpoint. So, with that in your mind, let's talk about what kind of remakes the Faithful are. The Faithful are remakes that are made by their namesake. They stay true to the original game and aren't looking to reimagine it. These games don't go to change the core gameplay to more modernized standards, or even completely different genres. Instead, they recreate the original game's gameplay and experience by keeping the campaign relatively the same. Games like this may also look to add in a few things that may have been cut from the original due to time constraints. These games don't look to reinvent the game they've taken. Instead, they more or less set out to recreate the original magic for a modern audience. Two great examples of this are SpongeBob Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated and the Crash Bandicoot N-Sane trilogy. Rehydrated was created around keeping the main game as functionally similar to the original as Purple Lamp was able to do, as well as what Toys for Bob did with the N-Sane trilogy. Both games, despite some slight differences in the physics and platforming, an unfortunate byproduct of working on a different engine, look to create as close an experience to the originals as possible. The game is kept relatively the same, and the most notable change these remakes tout are improved visuals. Both games also add in bits of content that were cut from the original, but this added content did not disrupt the flow of the game's campaign. These types of remakes also may change a few things that may have an infamous reputation, such as overly frustrating level segments or unfair parts that detract from the player's experience. Granted, like anything, a game doesn't necessarily have to do that. Rehydrated changes very little about it, such as keeping the infamous Rube Goldberg spatula the same, while Black Mesa, a fan recreation of Half-Life on the Source engine, features a completely overhauled Zen world due to the original being considered the weakest part of the game. When a rework is as large as Black Mesa's Zen, the game straddles the line between a faithful remake and a reinvention. But with this example, I'd say it still falls in line with a faithful due to the fact that a majority of the game was meant to be an improved player experience on the Source engine as opposed to the Gold Source engine of the original game. I'd say the faithful encompasses a majority of remakes we've received at this time, since it's definitely the category that requires less work in terms of development brainstorming. Not to say these types of remakes don't have work put into them, they certainly have a lot of talent behind them, but they also have a very strong basis to develop off of. Something I want to make clear though is that even if you recognize that a game is meant to be faithful, doesn't mean you can't criticize it for things it doesn't try to improve on from the original. For instance, if the original game had a particularly infamously designed portion that resulted in an unfair experience to the players, just because they're trying to be faithful to the original doesn't mean they shouldn't try and make it a more positive experience. Being a faithful remake doesn't mean developers can't fix issues with the original games, especially since they are creating the game from new code. However, if these tweaks lead to major changes in the game, more than likely the remake is what I like to call a reinvention. These are remakes that look to completely change the game they're remaking, usually to current day standards and mechanics. Two solid examples of this are Final Fantasy VII Remake and GoldenEye 007 on the Wii. These two games completely overhaul the originals into what was their modern day hardware at the time, as well as implementing advances within their own genres and series. Final Fantasy VII took notes from its current ARPG genre, making battles happen in real time as opposed to turn-based. GoldenEye completely revamped the story to fit in line with Daniel Craig's era and portrayal of Bond, resulting in levels being added, removed, and a more modern take on the FPS gameplay. Reinventions are what many people consider to be the standard for remakes, as these types of games become entirely new experiences as opposed to a similar experience to the originals that faithfuls bring. This is where many of the issues with judging remakes come from. Several people expect remakes to bring something new, maybe even drastic changes, and therefore find remakes that fall more in line with faithfuls to be lazy and bad. Distinguishing what type of remake a game is set out to be is incredibly important when judging it. If you go into a faithful remake with the expectations of the game being a reinvention, or vice versa, you will likely be disappointed by the experience and have a relatively negative view of the game. Expectations are a dangerous thing, especially when it comes to video games. Remakes and sequels are both things that fans end up setting high expectations for, especially remakes of games they have fond memories of. In terms of faithful remakes, these types of expectations can go two different ways. The first is that the remake recreates the experience they had years ago, or in other words, that it stays true to its categorization of a faithful remake. Others may not want to relive their experience, but want to have a new one that's accompanied by a familiar feeling they got from the original time playing the game. For the reinventions, expectations may be that of an entirely new experience, which usually means a more modern experience to the genre. Even if you can successfully categorize what type of remake a game will be, people are still susceptible to expectations, and having those expectations lit on fire and thrown into a trash can by the final product they receive. In line with expectations being dangerous to the judgment of a remake, nostalgia is just as, if not more dangerous than one's expectations. Nostalgia kind of works as an opposite to expectations. While expectations generally result in disappointment with the actual execution of a remake, nostalgia can result in blinding your judgment. Like stated earlier, nostalgia is a powerful tool to companies nowadays. They know nostalgia will sell just about anything, and therefore some remakes don't necessarily come with the highest production quality, or the insight to fix flaws within the original. By having on those rose-colored glasses, you may just accept the exact same flaws that were also present in the original and not realize they were probably something that should have been fixed given that the developers had the opportunity to do so. Even if a remake is looking to be faithful to the original, that doesn't mean it can't go in and fix, say, frustrating level design, frustrating gameplay segments, or even just bugs the remake itself has. On the side of the reinventions, though, the nostalgia of the original may get in the way of a person enjoying the newly crafted experience. They may be wanting to relive what they experienced years ago, and may dislike the changes the reinvention brings to the table. Nostalgia affects the view a person has on any type of remake, and is something that needs to be understood and kept in check just like expectations. Regardless of your view on remakes in general, it's important to be able to distinguish which type of remake it's trying to be when judging a game. If you don't, you'll end up reviewing a game unfairly, and ending up with something like the now infamous GameSpot and IGN review of Rehydrated.
Every entrance to a new area is saddled with a few seconds of loading time, even when going into a small building like Patrick or Squidward's one-room homes. But in a platformer still meant to be enjoyed today, I have to ask, why do I have to keep trudging back to a specific location to switch characters, instead of just quick swapping with a button?
Moving platforms are slow, and you have to jump on them often. If you miss them, you end up bored sitting there, looking at an idle animation for too long. There were multiple points in the game where I climbed up to the top of a high structure, and a rogue robot knocked me all the way down into the water. But you can't run in this game, or dodge, or swap characters conveniently. It's a game so focused on emulating and embellishing the original that it doesn't know the parts of itself that are fun and the parts that aren't.
Something that's important to note, though, is that regardless of what type of remake a game is trying to be, they are not immune to criticism. For instance, if a game is trying to remain faithful and as close to a one-to-one remake as possible, if they gloss over fixing issues that plague the original game, that is grounds for criticism, as they didn't bother to look to improve what was already there and make the experience better. On the other hand, if a reinvention changes something that doesn't actually end up being implemented well, or was something from the original that didn't really warrant an overhaul, that too can be criticized. It becomes unfair criticism when a remake is judged for not being either faithful or a fully new experience, based on what type of remake the developers set out to create. When looking at a remake, be sure to have expectations that fit accordingly to which of the two types it's going to be. Now, which type of remake is the superior one? Well, that's subjective and all up to you, but let me know your opinion in the comments. Yeah, that's how I'm ending this video. Who needs a proper conclusion? Special thanks to my Delirious Death Merchants, Damp Volcano, and GTY200, because you certainly have to be delirious to be my highest supporters. Also, thanks to Mauricio Esparza, As Is Light, and Pugs501.